She was born of the Jewish tribe Bani Nadir. She was beautiful. Captured and made a slave by the Muslims during a siege. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, took her under his custody and presented her with the beautiful gift of accepting Islam. Her name is Rayhanah Bint Amr. Join host lailanasheeba for the popular series Heroines of Islam every Monday and Wednesday 9 p.m. Eastern right here on Sunnahfollowers.
Welcome to our series, The Heroines of Islam. And for those of you who are new, this series, The Heroines of Islam, I will, inshallah, embark upon trying to share with you every week, twice a week, the stories of the female companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why I'm teaching this series is because so many of the new converts, the Muslim sisters, come to me and ask, can I tell them about the female companions? Because the female companions are not discussed much here in the West. And when they do discuss it, they water it down. Not all information is given. And this is so true. One of the things that I hope that everyone who's been following me and listening to this series understands, there's a big misconception about Muslim women in Islam. Number one, the world thinks that Muslim women are oppressed, that Muslim women have no dignity, that Muslim women have no rights, that Muslim women are inhibited, that Muslim women are depraved and deprived, that Muslim women are not attractive, that Muslim women are not feminine, that Muslim women are not anything, that Muslim women are supposed to be as if they don't exist. All of these are simply misconceptions about the role of women in Islam. Nowhere does Islam teach that women are to be ignored, nor does Islam teach that women are to be as if they don't exist. Because anyone who learns this religion and learns it correctly, you will learn from the beginning of its conception that women were never ignored. The women were never as if they did not exist. As I went over this series, I began with the wives of the Prophet. Who was the one that was with the Prophet from the beginning that helped him to see that he was not crazy, that he was not possessed? That was a woman, and that woman was not in the background unseen by anyone. That woman was not like a creature that didn't exist. That woman was Khadija, radiallahu anha. Khadija was the second person to embrace Islam and to accept him as a prophet. Okay? And Khadija, radiallahu anha, was there with the Prophet at the beginning of his mission, his confidence, his support. Allah even speaks about this. His confidence, his support came from Khadija, radiallahu anha. She was not in the background, unmentioned, unseen, insignificant. In fact, I hope that you guys have learned it's not even the nature of an Arabic woman to be unheard, unseen, insignificant. I hope you guys have realized that. When you learn about the Prophet Muhammad's wives, you learn that many things these brothers today have told you about women is untrue. And I'm speaking to the women in the West because Arabic women know their value. Arabic women know their worth. Arabic women are not censored. Arabic women don't feel that they are insignificant. Arabic women, it's in their blood to be right there beside the men. Okay? One of the first martyrs of Islam was a woman. A woman. A woman. Okay? The person that supported the Prophet, a woman. His biggest support, a woman. All of the Prophet's wives were mentioned by name in the hadiths. All the Prophet's wives were described. The simple fact that these hadiths describe how beautiful the Prophet's wives were show that they were not some insignificant nothing. The hadiths that mention how his wives corrected others shows that they had a voice, that they were not inhibited, that they were not censored. The fact that Aisha radiallahu anha was the wife who became one of the first scholars of fiqh underneath the caliphate of Umar. Umar assigned all questions about the role of women in Islam to be answered by Aisha radiallahu anha. Okay? The simple fact that Aisha was the one who kept correcting the mistakes made by the men of her time in regards to women, and she corrected them. And she would check what they say. Whatever they said, she would verify it and give the history of it. That all shows that women in Islam do not take a back seat. Women in Islam are not shushed. Women in Islam are not depraved or deprived of anything. On the battlefield, you guys have learned that even on the battlefield, every battle that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam fought, his wives were on that field. He would take a wife with him on every expedition. After he married Salama was at every battle, and she was active on that battlefield. Okay? Sauda radiallahu anha, she was the oldest wife he had, in her 60s. But you got to experience from Aisha that even Sauda was a great, furious warrior, because the Arabic women were just like the Viking women of the time. Were just like the Roman women of the time. Were just like the Persian women of the time. Were just like the Egyptian women of the time. These were the days of warriors. They were warriors. As Hakim said, when I'm going to go over her story with you guys too soon. When the Arabs underneath the leadership of Khalid bin Walid, when they fought against the Franks, like Hakim said, when they were taken as captive, as prisoners of war, as she told the Arabic women with her, she said, "We women are women of the tents. We will pull these poles out of the ground. And we will show these non-believers that we are not a women that they don't want to reckon with." And when those men came to them, they took them poles and went to town on them. So again, it's important to learn about the female companions of Islam, because when you learn about these women, you learn that the things that you have been told, many of it is not true. Okay? Such as covering the face. The Prophet's wives did not cover their faces. As Aisha tells us, if they wanted to cover a face, or if they wanted to not be recognized, when the women would go out, they would go out in a group for their protection at nighttime. And they didn't want to be recognized. Why? So that the enemies could not capture and hold for ransom one of the wives of the Prophet. All the women would go out in a group and they would do this. So you couldn't tell who was who. And then they take it down. They do this and take it down. That's if they didn't want to be recognized. They didn't walk around with burqas on. They didn't walk around with just one eye like a cyclops. Allah didn't make a woman with one eye. We're not animals. We're human, as Aisha radiallahu anha said. Okay? So, it's important to learn about these female companions, because learning about them tells you what your role should be as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. And also you see, wow, the things I've been told here in the West, because like I said, Arabic women know their worth. You Western women will learn, things I've been told that I can't do, it's not true. Not at all. Not at all. So today what we're going to do to just conclude the topic of the wives of the Prophet, because I covered all his wives. The last time we met, we did the story of Maria the Copt, and she was not a wife. She was one of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's right-hand possessions. But she was not the only slave girl he had. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had another slave girl. Her name was Rayhanah. And I'm going to do her story today. And just like many people say that the Prophet married Maria, but he really did not. He did not marry Maria. He also was never married to Rayhanah either. Aisha did not list either one of these women as a wife of the Prophet. Aisha tells us in Bukhari, in Muslim, she talks about the other wives, her relationship with them, the jealousy that existed amongst them. And also she speaks about how after the Prophet's death, they all came together and they all made up and became as one single unit. She does not mention Maria as a wife. She mentions Maria as a slave and also Rayhanah as a slave. But just as Maria was a Copt from Egypt, one of the original Arabs, she was one of the original Egyptians. The original Egyptians were Semitic. They were Semitic people. They were Copts. Okay? She was Arabic. Well, Rayhanah was another slave woman of his, and Rayhanah was Jewish. She was Hebrew. When I say Jewish, I mean Hebrew. That was her race. She was Hebrew like Safiya, radiallahu anha. But the difference was between her and Safiya is the Prophet married Safiya, because Safiya was the daughter of a prophet. Okay, but to answer the question, Rayhanah, he never married. Although many people say he did not marry Rayhanah. Aisha did not list her as a wife, and neither did the other wives of the Prophet. So let's do her story, and let me put the PowerPoint up on the screen so everyone can see and relate to it. Wait a minute, hold on. Okay, hopefully you guys can see my screen. So this is the story of Rayhanah. Her name, wait a minute. Her name was Rayhanah Bint Zaid. Okay? And let's take a look at her. She came into the picture after the Battle of the Trenches. In fact, she came into the picture the same time that Safiya came in. She was from the same people as the same tribe as Safiya. The difference was that Safiya was a princess. Safiya was the daughter of the chief, the ruler of the tribe. Whereas Rayhanah was from the nobility too, but she wasn't high up in stature as Safiya was. After the Battle of the Trench and the Quraysh returned back to Mecca, The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went back to Medina. He took off his armor and went to clean himself, to take a bath. And as he was bathing, that's when the angel Jibril appeared before him. And he said to the Prophet, you have removed your weapons? Why did you remove your weapons when the battle isn't over? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, where is the battle? What battle? We just defeated the Quraysh. And that's when the angel Jibril told him that the tribe of Qurazaya, who had betrayed the Muslims, and he had to contend with them. And the reason being was because just like the Jews, just like the tribe of Qurazaya, did not keep the promise that they made with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They thought that they could side with the Quraysh while he was fighting against them and attack from behind. But Allah sent the angel Jibril to notify the Prophet of what the Jews were planning. Okay? So after being informed, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam gathered the Muslims together. He said, pick up your armor. I've just been told by Jibril that we have been betrayed by the tribe of Qurazaya. He said, let all those who hear and obey not pray the afternoon prayer until we reach the land of the Qurazaya. So they planned to make their attack before the Jews had an opportunity to regroup. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his men gathered themselves together and set out, for the tribe of Qurazaya. And when the Jews saw him coming under the command of Ali, they began to regret what they had done. And they began to yell out terrible words to the Prophet, calling him offensive names. But when they saw that his army consisted of 3,000 men, that's when the Jews became afraid. They knew that there was no way that they could defeat the Muslims. Okay? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent Usayd ibn Hudayr forward to talk to the Jews. And he said, O enemies of Allah, we will continue to lay siege to your castle. Because that's what the Jews had done. They had locked themselves up in their fort. They locked themselves up in their fortress and refused to come out and fight. They were cowards. So Usayd went to them and said, O enemies of Allah, we will continue to lay siege to your castle until you die of starvation. So you're trapped. You're like a fox in a den. You have nowhere to go. You can't run. You can't hide. And the Jews called out to him and they said, O Ibn Hudayr, we are not allies of the Hajraj. We're with you. So they tried to lie and change sides again. But Usayd wasn't stupid. He said, we have no treaty with you anymore, nor do we have any covenant with you anymore. And that's when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his men approached the castle. And before fighting them, because remember in Islam we have rules to abide by even in war times. And by the way, this is a picture of a fortress, how their fortress may have looked, because there's a lot of fortresses like this in the desert abandoned, but this is what the fortresses look like. They would go and hide behind the gates of that. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam arrived with his men and he approached the foot of the castle and he tried to invite the Jews to Islam, but they refused. And after a while, the Jews began to feel pressured. And one of the leaders said, O Jewish congregation, this disaster has fallen upon us. We suggest three things Okay, this is one of the leaders of the prophet's army. This is Ka'b ibn Asad. He said, "O Jewish people, this disaster has fallen upon us. We suggest three things for you to choose one of." Okay? And the Jews asked him, "What three things?" And he said, "The first is you can affiliate with this man Muhammad and acknowledge him as a prophet." He said, "I swear by Allah that he really is a prophet. He and his characteristics have been written in the Torah. If you accept him as your leader, your blood, your honor, your women, your children, and your property will be safe." Remember, I told you guys back in the medieval period of history, whenever a town fought another town, or a tribe of people fought another group of people, or a country fought another country, whoever was the victor would take the spoils. And the spoils of the war were all the women and children of the defeated people would be given over to them as slaves. And whatever property they had would now belong to the victors. And the men were usually executed or enslaved. Okay? Most of the time they were executed. But the women and children were taken as spoils of war and divided up as slaves by the men. So this person's telling them, if you accept the Muhammad as your prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you and your families will be okay. But the Jews refused. They said, "We will never abandon our religion and replace it with another one." And when that was their answer, Ka'b, who was one of their leaders, he said, "Well, you might as well kill your women and children so that they don't become prisoners of war, because this battle with the Muslims will happen, and it will happen on a Saturday night." Okay? And of course, the Jews still refused to accept the prophet. But there were three young men who believed that the prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a prophet, and they converted. They left the castle that night and came over to the side of the prophet Muhammad. And then the next day, the prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam approached the Jews with his men, and the Jews were forced to surrender unconditionally. So the Qurazaya Jews were under the patronage of the Aus Arab tribe. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam called the leader of that tribe, whose name was Saud. You guys know about Saud. He called Saud to be a judge for them. And even though Saud had been injured in the battle, he answered to the request of the Prophet and came. Because when they fought against the Jews, Saud, had lost his family members, and also he had become injured. And he swore by Allah. He said, "Oh Allah, do not take my life until I have revenge on the tribe of Qurazaya for their betrayal to us." So Saud delivered the law he acted as a judge, and he delivered the laws of Moses in the Torah to the Jews. And the Prophet Muhammad agreed with it. In other words, Saud issued a fatwa, or a verdict, against the Jews for their betrayal. And he said, "Your punishment will be what Allah says in the Torah." And the Prophet Muhammad agreed with it. And what was that punishment? In the Torah, the punishment for treachery and betrayal is that the men who picked up the weapons to fight against you should be killed, and their property taken, and their women and children taken as spoils of war or prisoners of war. So that was the punishment laid out in the Torah for betrayal. And the Prophet Muhammad said this would be the same, it's okay with us in Islam too. So like I told you, the medieval period is not a good period in history for women, because before Islam, women had no rights. Only the strong women survived. You know, if you were weak, you were killed. If you were unattractive and weak and weren't worthy of being a man's bed woman or prostitution, they would kill you. The beautiful women and women from noble families were taken as prisoners of war and given to the victors as slaves. And their children, sometimes the children oftentimes were separated from their mothers and given as slaves to someone else. So it was a bad time for women. But Islam did away with that. We talked about how when the Prophet had taken Maria, the Copt, how Allah sent down so many rights for slaves and women and stuff. Those slave women in Islam were treated like wives, except they didn't have a specific day or night. Okay, but they were provided for, maintained, and if a slave woman got pregnant, you know, with your child, then she was automatically free, and so was the child. Okay, so Saul delivered the law, being that since these people broke their peace agreement and betrayed the Prophet and the Muslims, that the men who fought against him will be executed, and what the women and children will go as prisoners of war and be slaves for whoever, you know, wants them. If the woman wasn't wanted, she'd probably be executed. But not for us Muslims. They would keep them as just a slave. So Saud, radiallahu anha, Allah answered his dua. After he gave this ruling, that's when his wound opened up. Remember, y'all know who Saud is. And that's when he died from his wounds. And the companions got him ready for burial. The Prophet did his funeral. And despite how large and big a man Saud was, his body felt light. And that's because the Prophet said the angels came down and attended his funeral, and they helped carry his soul away. Okay. So after when the men were executed, and when it was time to divide the spoils of war, Rayhanah, she fell into the share that belonged to the Prophet Muhammad. She was a Jewish, woman. She was Hebrew, just like Sophia. And she was the wife of a Qurayshi Jew who was named Hakim. He was killed during the battle. So she was taken as a prisoner of war. And like the Prophet did with like the Muslims and other people did with slaves, a slave woman doesn't have a right to her own home. That's what makes her different from a wife. The Prophet had her appointed to stay in the house of a woman named Manzir. And I'm going to do her story one day too. So at this time, the Prophet had two prisoners of war, one being Sophia. And he ended up marrying her instantly because he recognized Allah sent down to him the revelation that Sophia was a descendant of Moses. So the Prophet, she converted to Islam. When the Prophet told her that he knew that she was the daughter of Aaron, that's when Sophia said, well, if you know that about me, then that means you are a prophet, because only a prophet would have that knowledge. And Sophia converted to Islam instantly, and the Prophet married her immediately, and her freedom was her dowry. So that was Sophia. Now Rayhanah was taken as a prisoner too. The Prophet just ordered whatever slave girls he had other than Sophia to be taken to Mandir's home. And when they arrived back in Medina, the Prophet went to the home of Rayhanah, who was now his slave girl. And he wanted to see her. And that's when the first time he saw her. And when he saw her, he gave her the offer. He said, if you want, you can choose to become a Muslim and then I will marry you. I'll make you my wife instead of my slave girl. She chose to remain a slave because she didn't know anything about Islam. All she knew is that she didn't like the Muslims. So she told him, no, I will remain a slave because this will be easier for me and it'll be easier for you because I'm not interested in your religion. Okay, so she made it clear that she would never leave her religion. But a few days later, some reports say 4 to 5 days later, she changed her mind. She came to the Prophet and converted to Islam. But the Prophet ﷺ did not marry her. There are some people that say he did, that when she converted, he married her, but the reality is he did not. She became a Muslim and she remained his slave. He had no interest in her because he had Safiya. Remember, this is when he had taken in Safiya, and Safiya was enough for him as a wife because she was going through enough of problems. So Rayhanah, that's basically her story, guys. She remained one of the right-hand possessions of the Prophet, and she died after the Prophet had came back from Hajj. And she was buried in the grave, the Baqi cemetery. Now remember, the Prophet ﷺ had Maria as a slave girl too. Maria didn't die before him. She died 5 years after him. But Rayhanah was a slave girl. And she died, right after the Prophet made Hajj. And guess what? He died after that. So that's basically it for Rayhanah. But you may find other people saying that he married her, but the reality is she didn't. Why I say that is because why would Aisha not mention her as a wife? In fact, Aisha made no mention of her at all, period. Okay? Aisha tells us of all the wives of the Prophet and their names. She mentioned Maria, and she said Maria was a slave girl too. But she made no mention of Rayhanah, being a wife or anything else. So that means she was somebody that for Aisha to not mention her, that means that she was someone who was not intimidating to Aisha. Remember, Aisha radiallahu anha was only intimidated by the ones that she thought posed to be a challenge to her. Evidently, she didn't feel Rayhanah to be a challenge to her because she doesn't mention her. Okay? She doesn't mention her at all. Okay? So, that's basically it. That's basically it about Rayhanah. And this picture here that I use is a picture of a medieval Hebrew woman. Just, I don't know how they say she was very beautiful, but this is a picture of a medieval Hebrew woman. But she converted to Islam. So she probably had features like this. The curly hair, the pale skin, and all of that. But she converted to Islam. All right. There's also another hadith, which I don't think it's authentic. It says that when the Prophet asked her to marry him, she said no, because she not only did she not want to give up her religion, but she didn't want to cover up like Muslim women either. She didn't want to cover her head. But I don't believe that hadith is authentic. And they say that when she came back a few days later and converted to Islam and said she would cover up, the Prophet told her he didn't want her as a wife after that. He said, okay, he took her shahada, he accepted her shahada and all, but he told her he was not interested in marrying her. Then there's another story that says he did marry her, but then he ended up turning her back over to her tribe because he didn't want to stay with her. So different stories, but like I said, I deal with what's most authentic. And what's most authentic is she remained a slave until she died after his Hajj. And like I said, she must not have been no threat to Aisha, because Aisha doesn't mention much about her at all. All right, so that's the story of Rayhanah.